Imagine the entire weight of a freight train, suspended in the air, moving at 500 miles per hour, at an altitude where the air outside is cold enough to freeze your blood in seconds. Now imagine that this train has dozens of small holes cut into its sides. And every single one of those holes is trying to tear the entire structure apart. That is what an airplane deals with every single flight, and here is the question nobody actually asks. Why are the windows round, not oval because it looks sleek? Not curved because some designer thought it was pretty. Round specifically because of a force so invisible and so relentless that when engineers got it wrong, planes literally fell out of the sky. This is not a design story. This is a survival story, and it starts with a shape. A corner. In the early 1950s, aviation was changing fast. World War II had pushed aircraft technology to incredible heights, and now the world wanted passenger jets. Fast ones, high-flying ones, the kind that could cross the Atlantic in hours instead of days. Engineers were optimistic. The math looked clean, the blueprints looked elegant. Britain led the charge. The de Havilland Comet was the world's first commercial jet airliner. It was beautiful, sleek, modern, fast. Passengers loved it. Airlines loved it. It was the future sitting right there on the runway. And then the planes started breaking apart in midair. Not because of bad weather, not because of pilot error, not because of anything obvious. These aircraft were simply disintegrating at cruising altitude, pieces of fuselage scattered across the ocean. No warnings, no distress calls, just silence. The investigations that followed were some of the most meticulous in aviation history. Engineers tore apart every surviving comet they could find. They ran pressure tests. They simulated flights inside giant water tanks. They were looking for something, some flaw, some hidden weakness. What they found changed aircraft design forever. The windows, but not the glass. Not the seal, not the frame, the corners. To understand why corners are so dangerous, you need to understand what an airplane fuselage actually experiences when it flies. At sea level, the air pressure outside your body and inside your lungs is roughly the same. You do not notice it. But climb to 35,000 feet, the cruising altitude of most commercial jets, and the outside air pressure drops dramatically. The air up there is thin. There is barely enough oxygen to keep a candle lit. This is a problem for humans who need to breathe. So engineers pressurize the cabin. They pump air in, keeping the inside pressure at roughly the equivalent of being at 8,000 feet. It is not sea level, but it is breathable. It is survivable. But now you have a metal tube with high pressure inside and extremely low pressure outside. That difference, that gap between what is pushing outward from within and what is pushing inward from without, is called the pressure differential. And that pressure differential is trying constantly to explode the fuselage outward. Every single flight, every single minute in the air. Now think about what a pressurized cabin does to a fuselage. It expands slightly like a balloon being inflated. And then on descent, as pressure equalizes, it contracts again. This is called pressurization cycling, and every cycle stresses the metal. Engineers call this fatigue. It is the same reason a paperclip breaks if you bend it back and forth enough times. The metal does not snap immediately. It accumulates damage, invisible internal damage, and eventually, without warning, it fails. Now here is where geometry becomes life or death. When you have a structure under stress, the stress does not distribute itself evenly. It flows through the material like water through a landscape. It finds paths, it concentrates at certain points. Engineers call this stress concentration, and stress concentration absolutely loves corners. A corner is where two edges meet at an angle, and at that angle, stress does not spread out smoothly. It piles up. It stacks on itself. The sharper the corner, the more intense the concentration. It is like pressing your entire body weight onto the tip of a single nail versus pressing it onto a flat surface. Same force, catastrophically different result. The early Comet had windows with square corners, clean, rectangular windows that looked perfectly normal. And every time that aircraft pressurized, stress concentrated at those four corners. Every cycle added a little more fatigue, a little more invisible damage, until one day the metal could not hold anymore. A crack formed at a corner, microscopic at first. Then in a fraction of a second it propagated. It ran along the fuselage faster than any human reaction. The pressure differential finished the job, the aircraft tore itself apart. Physics says otherwise, and physics won. So what is the solution? If corners concentrate stress, you eliminate corners. The simplest shape with no corners at all is a circle. A circular window distributes stress evenly around its entire perimeter. There is no single point where stress can pile up. The load spreads itself continuously, smoothly, in every direction simultaneously. It is an elegant solution to a brutal problem. But the engineering goes deeper than just the shape of the opening. The windows on a modern commercial aircraft are not simply holes in the fuselage. They are engineered systems. Multi-layered, pressure-rated, thermally designed systems that exist within a larger web of structural support. Start with the glass. It is not actually glass. Modern aircraft windows use stretched acrylic. Stretching realigns the internal molecular structure of the acrylic, making it significantly stronger than ordinary material of the same thickness. The inner pane, the middle pane, and the outer pane each serve different structural and thermal roles. The outer pane bears the pressure load. It is the one in direct contact with the outside environment. It has to withstand temperatures as low as -60 degrees Celsius and a pressure differential that is constantly trying to push it outward. The middle pane is the structural backup. If the outer pane fails, the middle pane holds. It is not a redundancy added for comfort. It is a calculated engineering requirement, a safety margin built directly into the material stack. The inner pane is mostly protective. It shields the structural layers from passengers bumping into the window or pressing their faces against it. And there is a tiny hole drilled into the middle pane. Passengers notice it sometimes and get nervous. That hole is intentional. It equalizes pressure between the inner pane gap and the cabin, ensuring the outer pane bears the full structural load rather than the inner one. It also allows moisture to escape, preventing fogging. That tiny hole has a name. Engineers call it the breather hole. And it has saved lives by simply existing. Now let us walk through what actually happens during a flight from a structural standpoint. The aircraft is sitting on the ground. Cabin pressure is equal to sea level. The fuselage is at its natural, unpressurized shape. The windows sit flush in their frames. The metal is relaxed, engines spool up, the aircraft climbs. As altitude increases, the ground crew seals the cabin and begins pressurization. Air is pumped in. The fuselage begins to expand almost imperceptibly. Fractions of millimeters, but those fractions matter. Every window cut out in the fuselage is now surrounded by stressed metal. But because the windows are circular, the stress flows around each aperture smoothly. It does not stack, it does not concentrate, it distributes. At 35,000 feet, the pressure differential is at its peak. The metal is holding the difference between a survivable interior and a lethal exterior. The passengers are asleep. The flight attendants are serving drinks. Nobody is thinking about the engineering holding them alive. The pilot initiates descent. The pressure differential begins to ease. The fuselage contracts slightly. The metal cycles. It records another fatigue event. By the time this aircraft retires after perhaps 30 years of service and 60,000 pressurization cycles, every inch of that fuselage will have been tested, inspected, recertified, and stress analyzed more times than most structures humans have ever built. Modern aircraft are not just engineered to survive a flight. They are engineered to survive a lifetime of flights, tens of thousands of them. There is something else worth understanding. The fuselage skin on a modern jetliner is, in places, thinner than you might expect. Parts of the aluminum skin are only a few millimeters thick. That is roughly the thickness of a few stacked credit cards. At altitude, that skin is all that separates you from air that would render you unconscious in under a minute. But thin does not mean weak. The strength of the structure comes from its geometry and its integrated design. Stringers run lengthwise along the fuselage. Frames run circumferentially. Together they form a lattice that transfers loads across the entire structure. No single panel bears the full load, everything shares it. This is the philosophy of aircraft structural engineering. Redundancy, shared load paths, no single point of failure. The window frame itself is reinforced. The area around each opening is thickened locally to compensate for the material removed to create the hole. The circle ensures that reinforcement can be distributed evenly around the aperture without creating stress asymmetry. A square window would require much more complex local reinforcement. The corners would need disproportionate strengthening. The weight penalty would be significant. And even with that reinforcement, the fatigue behavior would be less predictable, less manageable over the life cycle of the aircraft. Round is not just structurally superior. Round is also lighter. Round is also cheaper to maintain over decades of operation. Every design decision in aviation is a negotiation between safety, weight, cost, and longevity. The circular window wins all four categories. There is a version of this story that ends with the Comet disasters and the engineers who solved them, and that is a satisfying ending. Problem identified, problem solved, lesson learned. But the deeper story is what those disasters revealed about how humans build things. For most of human history, we built structures that we could see failing. A bridge sags before it collapses. A wall cracks before it falls. The failure announces itself. You have time to respond. Metal fatigue does not announce itself. It is invisible, internal, and cumulative. It is not the catastrophic failure, but the quiet accumulation of ordinary stresses over time. And the Comet disasters forced engineers to confront a kind of failure that had no precedent in their experience. They had to develop entirely new ways of thinking about structural integrity, new testing methods, new inspection protocols, new safety factors. They invented, essentially, the science of damage tolerance. The understanding that structures will accumulate damage and that your job is to manage how, and when, and at what rate. Every aircraft that has flown safely since then carries within its design the hard lessons of those early failures. The round windows are not just a structural feature. They are a memorial to the engineers who got it wrong and the ones who had the rigor to understand why. Next time you sit beside an aircraft window and look out at the clouds below, notice the curve of the frame around the glass. Notice that there are no corners. Notice the faint ring of fasteners around the perimeter, each one a carefully calculated interval apart, each one carrying its precise share of the load. That curve is not aesthetic. It is not branding. It is not an accident. It is the answer to a question that took human lives to ask correctly. It is the shape that stress prefers to travel around rather than through. It is the geometry of survival, refined over decades, embedded into every commercial aircraft flying today, carrying hundreds of people safely across distances that would have seemed impossible to anyone born 2 centuries ago. Engineering is not just problem-solving. It is the patient, meticulous, sometimes tragic process of learning what the universe will and will not allow. And the universe, it turns out, does not allow corners.